Welcome to this presentation titled Sex Work, the Epitome of Women's Oppression or Liberation. My name is Larissa Heuer and I'm currently enrolled as a PhD student at the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. The outline of this presentation will be as follows. It will start with a brief introduction and the objectives of the presentation. Then I will address the methodology, leading over to an overview on feminist perspectives on sex work, theories on women in the economy, and will combine these theoretical approaches in a brief case study of female sex workers in South Africa. In the end, there will be a bibliography with references for your perusal. By addressing the research question, is sex work the epitome of women's economic oppression or liberation? This presentation aims to achieve a greater understanding of women's situation in economies and labor markets in relation to their roots into sex work. The assumption is that feminist theories often ignore the economic contexts in which women found themselves prior to entering the commercial sex industry. Ultimately, this has led to discriminatory policy and lawmaking influenced by these theoretical underpinnings and facilitates the violation of sex workers' human rights and therefore women's rights. To answer the research question, I've conducted a desk-based critical analysis of feminist discourses on female sex work, theories on women's roles in the economy, and their potential routes into the commercial sex industry. I've tried to ensure that my sources represent a variety of schools and backgrounds, but I've tried to avoid research that conflates sex work, as per the definition in this presentation, with human trafficking, slavery, and the prostitution of minors. In this regard, let me quickly define what sex work is. Sex work is the consensual exchange of sexual services in return for material gains amongst adults over 18 years old. It includes, but is not limited to, telephone sex, escort services, stripping, parlor and brothel work, street walking, domination, and porn movie acting. Depending on the services offered, sex work can take place indoors or outdoors. A sex worker is therefore someone who offers these sexual services in return for material gains. The choice of wording when it comes to discourses on sex work deserves a bit of attention as well, as it often reflects a certain understanding of the subject. The term sex work indicates an understanding of voluntary engagement without coercion, whereas the term prostitution implies forced sexual exploitation. The term sex work itself is a relatively new creation, coined only in 1978 by Carol Lee, a former sex worker and sex workers' rights activist. She believed that the traditional term prostitution carried too many negative connotations and that a new, more neutral terminology was needed. Sex workers have since been quick to adopt the new term for their movement. So this presentation will respect sex workers' choice of self-conception, and the term prostitution will only be used when it reflects the theoretical or historical context. The competing understandings of sex work have led to the development of broadly two feminist blocs: anti-sex work feminists and pro-sex work feminists. Anti-sex work feminists argue that prostitution can never be voluntary or considered work, as it is the epitome of women's oppression and exploitation in a male-dominated world. Based on the assumption that all prostitution is forced and inherently violent, it is emphasized that no one would remain in prostitution if they had a choice. Prostitution further reinforces the objectification and commodification of women as disposable bodies to satisfy men's needs. Only the complete eradication of prostitution will allow women to be free and liberated from the confines of patriarchy. Pro-sex work feminists agree that society is characterized by structural inequality between men and women. However, they stress women's agency when it comes to their choice of profession or generally on how to overcome the disadvantaged situation and to emancipate themselves. They advocate for a strict differentiation between forced and voluntary sex work and criticize the conflation of sex work with crimes such as human trafficking, sexual slavery, and the prostitution of minors. Pro-sex work, mostly liberal feminists, further argue that the victimization of sex workers by anti-sex work feminists, mostly radical feminists, as exploited and oppressed, reinforces patriarchal stereotypes of women's sexuality and dependence that feminism is actually supposed to overcome. In summary, based on these two feminist standpoint theories of anti- and pro-sex work feminism, sex work is either a form of oppression or liberation, but it can never be both. Other feminists, from postmodern, post-structural, and critical strands of feminist thought, challenge that polarization. These feminists see the binary understanding as counterproductive and warn of the generalizations that come with it. As two examples, the focus of socialist and Marxist feminism lies on women's disadvantaged economic situation in male-dominated labor markets and economies. According to socialist feminists, oppression and exploitation in sex work is not considered different from any other exploitative work. The fight against exploitative sex work falls under the general worker struggle against the exploitation of labor. In addition to the economic focus of socialist and Marxist feminism, black feminist thought, post-colonial feminism, and generally feminisms from the global south have put increased emphasis on the intersection of gender, race, and class with women's economic, social, and political position. Following in the footsteps of those feminists who critically eye the anti versus pro-sex work argument, the following part will focus on women's situation in sex-segregated labor markets and economies. Most economies are increasingly built on women's labor these days. However, women's experiences differ greatly from those of men. Women of all social groups, nationalities, and ethnicities, married or unmarried, mothers or childless, are mostly employed in low-quality, low-wage, part-time, or informal work. This subsequently lowers their socioeconomic status and makes it impossible to make a living, not to mention to provide for a family. Many forms of female labor are further extremely exploitative and have negative effects on women's health and well-being. Many predominantly female professions, such as seamstress or garment worker in clothing factories, come with serious safety risks and precarious working conditions. Women's natural ability to bear children can put them at an economic disadvantage as well. Women are often less educated, are only educated in less relevant industries. In many societies, women are considered to be responsible for household duties and childcare and do not get the same education opportunities. Additionally, these unpaid family and household duties limit women's ability to participate and compete in labor markets and the paid economy. Many employers see female workers as higher cost and less productive. Female workers need maternity leave, which forces employers to find a substitute, require more leave days on average, are late more often, and less flexible than men, all mainly caused due to the unevenly distributed family and household responsibilities. Also, many women have to temporarily leave their jobs because of pregnancy and childcare duties, and experience difficulties in trying to get back into the market after long periods of unemployment. Discrimination against women in wages and job type are just some of the many consequences. The dual obligations of paid and unpaid work, if paid work is available, leave many female workers with only few employment options. Part-time work is often the only compromise, but offers less income and career prospects. But low income, time not spent in full-time work, irregular pension contributions, and early retirement put many women at risk of old age poverty if there is no social safety net or comprehensive welfare. Governmental policies can further aggravate women's economic disadvantage. Policies concerning childcare, for example unpaid or no maternity leave, policies regarding taxes, higher taxes for singles, which ultimately affect single working women and create incentives to get married, policies concerning inheritance and property, for example, discriminatory practices that disadvantage women and girls in coming to an inheritance or getting a loan, and finally, policies on welfare and birth control, for example, limited or no access to birth control and reproductive health care. All of these aspects can have a tremendous influence on women's economic situation. Having discussed sex work in general and women's situation in the economy and labor markets, we will now explore how potential routes into sex work are connected to the economic context in which women find themselves prior to entering the commercial sex industry. The starting point of many discussions of why women enter the sex industry is that they are driven by economic hardship. Admittedly, there are many sex workers that have confirmed that they've been forced by their economic circumstances. Anti-sex work feminists have argued that the idea of consensual sex obscures the real effects of women's multi-layered oppression on their ability to exercise individual free will. This especially concerns immigrants, minorities, single moms, sole providers of families, women with criminal records or little education, broadly speaking, women from underprivileged backgrounds who have fallen through any social safety net. Considering that it is mostly women from the low socioeconomic classes with little education and from disadvantaged racial and ethnic groups, it should be taken as a strong indicator that prostitution is the epitome of women's economic oppression. Sigma Huda, in her report for the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, shares this position and states that the act of prostitution, by definition, joins together two forms of social power, sex and money, in one interaction. In both realms, sexuality and economics, men hold substantial and systematic power over women. In prostitution, these power disparities merge in an act which both assigns and reaffirms the dominant social status of men over the subordinated social status of women. She further stresses that the demand for commercial sex is often grounded in social power disparities of race, nationality, caste, and color. Pro-sex work feminists acknowledge the fact that women's decision to engage in sex work can happen out of economic desperation and a combination of other unfortunate circumstances. However, the focus on forced survival sex as the only reason for women to engage in sex work only portrays the most extreme forms of sex work. Interviews with Swedish sex workers by Levy have shown that many women appreciate sex work as a convenient way to top up their primary income or to be able to afford a certain lifestyle. In this context, women had a variety of choices. For many of these women, sex work is a lucrative alternative to other jobs or a convenient extra income. As previously mentioned, women's earnings are lower than men's in most industries throughout the world. Not having to work in an underpaid, time-intensive and dangerous profession, but to have control over one's own working hours and conditions is an appealing alternative for many women. It is misleading to assume that all sex workers are lonely and desperate streetwalkers. Many sex workers do not only work for themselves, but support their children and families as well. In this regard, women's responsibilities for breadwinning, as well as housework and childcare, affect the types of jobs many women prefer. Flexibility and easy entry and exit opportunities in the job are key factors under these circumstances. For many women, sex work offers exactly that and has a liberating effect. The following anecdote by a sex worker interviewed by Lucas demonstrates a concrete example. When I see those talk shows where the topic is sex work, somebody in the audience will stand up and say, I put myself through college and I worked 3 jobs and I worked at Dunkin' Donuts and I did this and that and I didn't have to do what you do. I just think to myself, you're an idiot. You could have worked one night and been home studying, taking care of your kids or whatever. To illustrate the previous findings based on a more concrete example, we will have a brief look at the economic situation of women in South Africa and how it might influence their decision to enter the commercial sex industry. Sex work in South Africa is prohibited under the Sexual Offences Act. However, the reality is that sex work is a lucrative industry and widespread phenomenon in South Africa. The majority of sex workers in South Africa is black females and exposed to compound stigmatization due to their race, gender, profession, and the poverty and social inequality that is related to it. With 27.7% of the total labor force and 57.4% of the youth unemployed, according to UNDP, there is often no alternative for many South African women. More so, women find themselves in an even more difficult situation, as about 30% of South Africans are of the opinion that men should have more rights to a job than women considering these unemployment rates, according to the World Values Survey. Regarding the gendered social norms and attitudes in South Africa, it is important to acknowledge how sexist and patriarchal structures are intertwined with racism and lead to the exclusion and marginalization of whole groups of women from competing in labor markets and the economy. Research by Richter et al. Has shown that many South African sex workers plainly see it as a feasible way to make a living, facing their disadvantaged situation in the South African economy. Participating sex workers in the study had an average of 2 dependents, with 54.5% living with a regular partner, which emphasizes that sex work is just one aspect of people's lives. To conclude the analysis on South African sex workers, I just want to add a quote by Bontois, who points out that women with tertiary education earn 1.5 times more through doing sex work than other work. Women who completed high school earn 1.7 times more. Women who have some secondary education but who did not complete high school earn 2.8 times more, and women who have only primary school education earn 5.4 times what they earn outside sex work. Looking at all the previous information and findings, one might wonder why sex work has to be understood as either the epitome of women's economic oppression or liberation only. Even though it might not be considered a real choice for many, sex workers actively choose to join the sex industry. Even though it might be a choice made facing limited alternatives, the point is that a choice has been made. At the same time, turning sex work into the most emancipating and liberating profession distorts and ignores the realities and economic desperation of many sex workers. In their study on sex work, Weatherall and Priestley embrace an open theoretical approach in conducting interviews with sex workers. Instead of treating sex work as oppressive or liberating, as competing definitions, they examined the discursive articulation of abuse and freedom in participants' accounts and made room for workers to have both experiences validated and acknowledged. They found that participants dynamically construct themselves and their experiences in both lives depending on the various contexts. They concluded that to adequately research sex work, we must acknowledge all forms and types of sex work and take sex workers' experiences seriously in all their diversity. The aim of the study was to explore the contemporary feminist discourses on female sex work to achieve a greater understanding of women's economic situation in relation to their roots into sex work. In conclusion, be it as a general source of income, to pay off debt, to afford a drug addiction, for pure survival, or to achieve a higher economic standard and ultimately social mobility, the economic reasons why women enter the commercial sex industry are as diverse as their individual life stories and circumstances. It has become clear that the binary understanding of sex work as either women's oppression or liberation alone is not useful to understand the complexities of women's realities in sex-segregated economies and labor markets. Although the underlying assumption in this paper was that the decision to enter the sex industry as a result of a cost-benefit assessment within sex workers' economic contexts and therefore a rational choice, this is not to say that choices may not be extremely limited. Therefore, sex workers' experiences and knowledge should be the foundation to reconstruct their realities, even if it means that feminist theory needs to address victimhood and agency at the same time. Changing the narrative of sex work will hopefully have a positive influence on sex workers' human rights situation and aid the improvement of women's social and economic situation. On the following slides, you can find all the sources and references. And since we're at the end of the presentation, I just want to say thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to your comments and feedback.